Welcome to Attached and Aligned. This is the workshop or masterclass where you're going to learn how to break the cycle of unhealthy relationships and insecure attachment so that you feel loved and you feel cared for. So here's what you're going to learn. You are going to learn the three big mistakes when it comes to attachment and better relationships. And you may be surprised by the third thing, as it's often what's not really spoken about in attachment and healing. You're going to learn how to break the patterns that have been keeping you stuck in the kind of relationships where you've been feeling unheard, unloved, and unsupported. And you are going to learn how to assess where you are now and lots more. So, before we get into that, who am I and why on earth should you be listening to me? Well, this is me, and I'm Lysandra Ledgetwood. I am a psychotherapist, and I'm also a relationship therapist, and I am the owner of New Frame Therapy, which I established in 2017. And I have been a therapist for just over a decade now, helping lots of women and also people in relationships who want to get better at relationships. I am also a wife. I am also a mum of two. I am a lover of Marvel, of iced oat milk lattes, but they have to be decaf. And yes, that's a thing. And it is still coffee, but it's obviously very weak coffee. But I also love sun loungers with cushions because who wants to lie on a very hard sun lounger? It's not for me. And so if you want to learn more about my work and some more of my content, you can go and check me out on TikTok and on Instagram. And that is my handle that you see down here, which is at New Frame Therapy. Also, I'm just going to be giving you a gentle invitation so that if you do want to work with me on the things that we've learned or the things that you've kind of unpacked and uncovered in this workshop, then it's really easy for you to scan this QR code and you can book in for a free 15-minute call and we can have a quick chat just to find out if I'm the right person to help. Okay, so enough about me. Let's make this about you. Now, we're going to look at healing attachment and healing from relationships from the lens of attachment patterns. And so, our earliest relationships are literally the blueprint for all of our future relationships as we go into adulthood. And quite often, there's so many big mistakes that people make, but I'm going to be covering three really big mistakes that people tend to make when they are on their journey to attachment and healing. Now, the first big mistake is something that I see quite a lot, and that is that you don't really understand what your relationship patterns are. And so I'm going to give you now a crash course in attachment and your patterns. And what I've done to kind of make this a little bit more accessible and easier for you to understand is that I've used characters from quite popular shows so that you've just got a point of reference. So even if you haven't watched these shows before, no big deal. But if you have, then it can just give you a little bit more insight as to what I'm referring to and the kind of personality traits and character traits and how that shows up in relationships and how that also might apply to you. Okay, so first we are going to look at anxious attachment, and this is through the lens of Monica Geller. And when I'm talking about anxious attachment, I'm really looking at her character in the earlier seasons of Friends. So this is before she gets married, before she gets with Chandler. This is what her relationship patterns were looking like before that more secure relationship. And in those earlier years and in those earlier stages of her dating life and looking at different relationships, you would quite often see that she was really clingy within her relationships, and she would often doubt herself, often overthink about the relationship, often be really quite obsessed with being in a relationship and getting married and having children, and really just wanting more than anything to find the one. And she was almost obsessed with that. And she would quite often end up choosing emotionally unavailable partners or people who didn't want to have that same level of commitment as her, which would also then cause her to even become more anxious in her relationship and have more self-doubt, and quite often have quite questionable behavior that got her into a lot of trouble and awkward situations. which you might also be able to relate to if you are somebody who is constantly texting your partner or wanting a text to be responded to immediately, or if you're kind of stalking on Instagram, you're trying to pick up where they're from, you're in their Snapchat, you're in their stories. If that's something that you can relate to, you might be more on the anxious attachment side of the spectrum, because attachment is on a spectrum and we can have these different forms of relating within our relationships. And something that was really at the core of where this character's, Monica Geller's, anxious attachment came from was that she often had really difficult relationships, not only with romantic relationships, but it also began with her earliest relationship, meaning the relationship with her parents. And she had she had a very critical mother, and she was always overachieving, very much a people pleaser, and very much looking for that validation outside of herself, looking for that validation from her parents and also from her mum, who would also be super critical and just pick up on any negative, even when it wasn't negative. She would really just find ways to just make her feel not good enough and not worthy. And that definitely translated into how she felt about herself and how that would translate into her relationships. And then we have the avoidant attachment. And for this attachment, I've used the example of Samantha Jones in Sex and the City. Now, I don't know if you watch Sex and the City or not, but although Samantha Jones was a character who was extremely confident, she was very emotionally avoidant in relationships. And you would have seen that romantic relationships often made her feel very uncomfortable. And although she was an amazing friend, she really struggled to have closer intimacy in relationships that wasn't just related to just the physicality of sex. And so she would use that as a way to not be very emotionally connected within her relationship and with her romantic partners. And she would often get very bored within her relationships. She would be very matter of fact, and it would almost appear like she had no feelings. So she was very avoidant of getting into anything deeper. And that's often what shows up in the avoidant attachment in relationships. It's that you can be almost afraid of commitment. And this usually occurs because you've had inconsistent caregiving in your childhood as well. And so you've learned how to become very self-reliant, very self-dependent, because you've learned from a very early age that you can't rely on the adults that are around you, because they're inconsistent for one, but they're also just focused on other things. And maybe they've got struggles with, their own emotional well-being or their own relationships, or they're just busy with working and they're not very emotionally attuned to what your needs are. And so one way of coping is that you figure out that you have to be completely independent on yourself and to not rely on others. But what that can do is that can cause your relationships to be really strained, and for it to feel like you are an emotionally unavailable person. So it's not very easy for you to connect to your feelings, and it's not very easy to feel connected to you within a relationship. And then we have disorganized attachment. And I've looked at this through the lens of Joe Goldberg in the Netflix series You. So a huge, massive caveat to this, right? Okay, because yes, he was a mentally unwell sociopath, but I don't want you to relate that part of this character with a disorganized attachment, because it's completely separate things. And of course, these are based on fictional characters in a TV show. So, don't hold too much weight to the kind of person that he was in that regard, but more about the relational aspect of how he managed relationships and his history with trauma. And so what we saw from this character is that he was very obsessive, and he was also very distant a lot of the time. He was unable to be in control of his emotions, and he had little to pretty much no regard for personal boundaries. And what was actually apparent was that he had a lot of history of childhood neglect and mistreatment, which was why he had all of these unhealthy value systems and beliefs and ideas about what relationships were. And so that was really the root cause of where that disorganized attachment and patterns in relationships came from. And then we have secure attachment. And what I want to say about this, and this secure attachment is looked at through the characters of Beth and Randall Pearson in the show This Is Us. I don't know if you were a fan of this show or not, but they were a really good example of what it looks like to have a secure attachment in a loving relationship. Now, their relationship wasn't perfect, their childhood wasn't perfect, and you definitely saw, that relationships are complex and it's not just about showing up as this perfect version of yourself. And that's not what secure attachment is. But what we saw in terms of secure attachment was that they were really willing to communicate with each other, and as a family as well. And it was really about loving in action and in words, but more so in action. So it wasn't just like empty words that were used. It was actually shown. They would show each other. They would openly express love. And I mean, you can just see it from this picture here as well. So they were emotionally available to one another. They often had quite a lot of self-awareness. And even though their pasts weren't, you know, filled without trauma, they both had their own history of, difficult family relationships and things, and other things that can potentially cause a disorganized attachment. Because they were able to have an open relationship in terms of communication and how loving they were towards each other, and they were both working on their issues. I even believe that maybe one or both characters actually also had therapy during the course as well, which also helped their relationship at the same time. So even though they had relationship struggles, it was something that they were still willing to work on. And that is also what can help you to move from disorganized attachment or anxious attachment to having a more secure attachment, even if you've had trauma in the past, even if you've had childhood trauma, or even if you've had unhealthy relationships or toxic relationships in the past. Okay, so now that we've looked at these different attachment styles, I want you to think about where you are and rate where you are in terms of your attachment. And so I've used just a very simple traffic light system here where you can rate yourself as either red, amber, or green. And red obviously means stop, as in no, it's not great, it's not good at the moment. And amber might mean that you're getting there, you're understanding more about your patterns. And then green might just mean that, yep, you're in a really good place with your relationships and understanding how your patterns are operating and how to become more secure in your relationships and within yourself. So just give yourself either the red, amber, or green. Okay, and then the second big mistake that I see pretty much with all of my clients who come with trauma and relational trauma and those kind of issues in therapy, especially if it's a couple who's also struggling with the relationship and knowing how to communicate effectively, it's poor boundaries. And if you've been aware of me for quite some time, you know that I have been talking about boundaries for quite a long time now, because it is literally the key foundation thing that you need for your relationships in order for your relationships to feel healthy. And it seems to be something that all of my clients struggle with, even if they think that they're okay with boundaries, because it's something that is such an ongoing issue. And boundaries always come up because it's something that we're all faced with all of the time. And it's not as easy as sometimes certain posts and things might make you believe it is, because it's something that is really very nuanced. And unless you understand more about boundaries and why they're so important to your relationships, it can be a real source of struggle. And the answer to that is, and this is something that I do with my clients, is the boundaries reset. And I'm going to show you just one small exercise that you can use to help you understand more about your own boundary style. Because once you know where you're at, it's going to give you clarity to know where and how you need to move forward. So generally, there are 3 types of boundary styles, and I want you to try to identify which one you identify with the most. So the first boundary style is an aggressive boundary style. And that looks like you're always saying no. So you've got quite rigid boundaries. You always think that your opinion is right. You're not willing to listen to the other person or use it based on context of what might be happening. You might be used to cutting people off. And you might be very confrontational with setting boundaries and very inflexible about it. And then we have the wise owl approach to boundaries, which is an assertive approach. And this is when somebody is able to identify and share when it's appropriate. They are able to recognize what their needs are within relationships. They can articulate their boundaries in a healthy way. So they have healthy communication when it comes to boundary setting. And they are also able to accept the no from others, which is also like a really important aspect of being able to not only speak on what your own boundaries are, but also to be on the receiving end of boundaries as well. And they tend to be quite adaptive. So it depends on the person and it depends on the context. And they're able to see more than just in black and white. They're able to be in the kind of gray area and use the relationship and their experience to be able to navigate how they go about setting boundaries. So there's not just one blanket rule for all situations and all people and all relationships, because frankly, that just doesn't work. And then the last boundary style is passive turtle. And so the passive turtle really is a bit of a people pleaser. The passive turtle is always saying yes. It's not really saying how you really feel about situations. It's not expressing a need. It's feeling guilty when you do express that need. It's having one-sided relationships, and it is oversharing and not taking into account if it's appropriate to share certain things with certain people. And so those are the three boundary styles, okay? So we've got aggressive tiger, we've got wise owl, and we've got passive turtle. So now I want you to think about your own style of boundary setting and rate where you're at. So red will probably mean that you're really bad at boundary setting and you're possibly the passive turtle. Amber might mean that you're getting better and you still have some work to do. So perhaps you might be the tiger in this scenario, where you're almost doing too much with the boundaries and you need to kind of pull it back in a little bit. Or you might be green, where you're all good and you can pretty much identify where you need to set boundaries and you can pretty much do that with ease. Okay, and then the third big mistake, which is where you either overreact or you underreact. And if you overreact, it's almost like you react first and then think about the response later or think about what you've done later. And so it often means that you're quite explosive and you're quite emotional without really taking the time to think about how you're responding. So you're not really feeling in control of your emotions. It feels like your emotions are more in control of you. And then when you're underreactive, you tend to shut down and you tend to withdraw and isolate, and you seem very out of touch with your emotions. And so if this is you, I want you to just acknowledge with self-compassion, but also accountability, because I'm also going to show you what you then need to do if this is something that is really a struggle within yourself and also how you show up in your relationships. And the thing that you need to focus on is really understanding your patterns. And how you do this is that you start to be curious about why you think, feel, and react the way that you do. Be curious about where it comes from, why it feels the way that it does, when it comes up, and just getting to know yourself more and understanding your patterns, but through that lens of compassion, so that you're not beating yourself up and you're not tearing yourself down. You're just using that open curiosity to learn more about yourself so that you can improve and improve your relationships as well. And you can do that by really mastering your emotions and you master your emotions by getting in touch with your feelings instead of trying to run away and trying to avoid addressing when an uncomfortable emotion or feeling or situation comes up. And when you start to reframe how we do that, because our emotions are actually really good sources of information, instead of being fearful of our emotions, if we use that as information to understand ourselves more, it helps us to process our emotions, and it helps us to regulate our nervous systems. It helps us to feel more regulated in our relationships, and it helps us to feel more regulated within ourselves when we understand ourselves more and we offer ourselves that self validation. And so I want you to rate where you are at the moment with your emotional regulation, because that's essentially what I've just described. It's understanding your emotions and where they're coming from. And when we focus on ourselves, because a really big thing that I see that people do, especially when they're working on attachment healing or they're just learning about attachment, is that they focus so much of their time and energy on what the other person might be doing, or what their ex might have done, or what the person they're in the relationship might be doing, and wanting to understand more about their behavior. Why do they do this? And Googling all these things. And really, the true power is you regulating your own emotions, you understanding yourself more. Because when we focus on ourselves and our own healing, that is the ultimate key to deeper healing, which just isn't spoken about enough. So it's not about focusing on what the other person is doing, or the kind of relationships or the kind of people that we feel that we're quote unquote attracted to. It's what have we made ourselves feel comfortable with? And when we get to learn about ourselves more, and we understand our patterns and we work on breaking those patterns, that is where our power is. So in terms of emotional regulation, I want you to now rate where you are with that. So red might look like you're out of control with your emotions. Amber can mean that you're getting better at emotional regulation and being in touch with your feelings. And green is that you are self-aware and you are able to self-soothe through your big emotions. And when you understand where you're at, that's going to give you clarity to be able to move forward and know what it is that you need to work on. Okay, so let's recap. The 3 things that you need to work on in order to have alignment with your attachment and alignment with your values and yourself and your relationships is to understand your relationship patterns, to get better at boundary setting. That one is very important. And to also work on your emotional regulation so that you can feel more in control of your emotions, rather than your emotions feeling in control of you. Okay, and so well done, pat on the back. You have made the first step to learning more about yourself, and you've made that commitment to yourself. And now I want you to kind of set your intention. And what I mean by that is for you to think about what your next steps are. So don't just watch this workshop or this masterclass, whatever, I don't know what the word for it is. Don't just watch this training, I'll just use that word, training, to intellectualize your feelings, and to watch it and then forget about it, and then just carry on with the same kind of patterns and not really showing up for yourself in order to heal or get better at relationships. Think about, even if it's just one small thing that you use from what you've learned today that you're going to work on, and be really intentional with what your next steps are going to be. I am very big on taking action, and to not just be in the learning phase and not to just be in the intellectualizing phase, but also looking at, okay, what's the next step that you take after you've learned all of this about yourself and about your relationships. And again, if you want to work with me on this, then you can actually just quickly take a picture and scan this QR code, and it will bring up my calendar, and you can book in for a free 15-minute call with me, and we can talk through how I can support you in this journey of healing your attachment style so that you can feel more secure in your relationships and show up and thrive in your relationships. And so that's a gentle invitation for us to work together. But if not, I am honestly rooting for you, and I wish you all the best in your healing journey. If you've enjoyed having this free training, then come and drop me a line on Instagram at New Frame Therapy, and just drop me a DM and say, hi, love the training. Let me know what you loved about it. And maybe I'll speak to you really soon.